Good day, chaps. So today's video is going to be on the Churchill Black Prince, a vehicle that gets a bad reputation from some quarters and praise from others. So let's have a look at its design and its development, and you can decide. The Churchill Black Prince was one of the last of an already outdated idea of infantry tanks. These were tanks that, as per the name suggests, were designed to support infantry, and would have weapons typically used to suppress obstacles that infantry would face, and operated at a speed slow enough to move with the infantry, yet have heavy armour to withstand hits as they approach these. To offset this design, the British used cruiser tanks as well. These were fast and light vehicles to engage enemy armour with high-velocity anti-tank guns. But for many, the whole idea was utterly pointless, with Montgomery saying in 1942 that while his cruisers could break through, they didn't have the logistics and infantry to follow up to take advantage, and that the infantry tanks could seize an objective but were too slow to capitalise on it, and what was needed was a capital or universal tank with both aspects. Montgomery had appealed to the War Office but was shot down by some of the old school thinkers, who liked the status quo, and the British would not see a true universal tank until the FV-201 and the Centurion, post-war. So it might come as a surprise then that the UK began to look at fitting a 17-pounder onto an infantry tank in 1943. Quite why they wanted the best anti-tank gun they could field fitted into an infantry tank is also a mystery. The desire to fit a 17-pounder onto a tracked platform had been there since 1941, and several options were on the drawing board, from cruisers with 17-pounder guns, such as the Challenger Mark I, self-propelled guns, and so forth, all of which makes more sense. And if the British used a classification similar to the Americans, in which we had light, medium and heavy tanks, then the Black Prince could have been classified as the latter, and a 17-pounder would have been more sensible. But that wasn't its doctrinal role. The Black Prince project was given the go-ahead, with work to be carried out by Vauxhall Motors, under the name Tank Infantry A43 Black Prince. I have as of yet found no original documentation using the name Super Churchill cropping up anywhere. So where did the name Black Prince come from, as this moniker is not unique to this vehicle? The vehicle is named after the 14th century Prince Edward, son of Edward III, who, unlike his weak grandfather, was a great military leader, tactician, strategist, chivalrist and reformer of the English military. Prince Edward earned his spurs at the Battle of Crécy, giving the French a thick ear after holding the English right flank. During this battle he came into contact with John of Bohemia, who, although blind and tied to his horse, put up a good fight with his loyal attendants tied to him, and they died fighting to a man. The Black Prince was impressed by this chivalrous deed, and took the fallen man's coat of arms, 3 white feathers, and made it his own. The symbol remains that of the Prince of Wales today, and is found on English currency. However, I digress. The name Black Prince and Edward, along with other royal titles such as Oswald and Queen, were used for experimental land vehicles, from mobile mines and remote-controlled vehicles to naval weapons such as Queen Swan, Queen Gull and Queen Bee. There were quite a few Black Prince weapon systems. The remote-controlled tanks, using converted Vickers light tanks and a modified Matilda II, were tested, while both the Valentine and Matilda flamethrower tanks were also called Black Prince, and the experimental land torpedoes were called Prince Edward. The later experiment to fit a 6-pounder gun into a Matilda, however, was not officially called Black Prince. The A43 Black Prince was to be based on the Churchill hull, and although that vehicle had started in a rather sorry state, by 1943 many of the initial issues had been rooted out. The Churchill itself had been updated over the years from the original 2-pounder to a 6-pounder and finally a 75mm gun. The Black Prince kept most of the original features, including the armour layout with 6 inches of stepped armour, and although the driver's position was moved forward slightly and the front mudguards and covers are tilted down to help his line of sight. The hull was wider and longer to accept a new turret ring to mount the 17-pounder gun. This new turret had an exposed mantlet in the same style as the later cruiser tanks such as Comet and Centurion, with a distinct lip to the lower edge. The suspension was strengthened with wider tracks, giving the Black Prince a beefier overall look, but the engine was kept as the double Bedford 12-cylinder engine. This engine was a 350 horsepower unit that was already underpowered in the Churchill, and was hopelessly underpowered in a tank now weighing 50 tons, leaving the vehicle only available to crawl along at 10.6 miles an hour, on even ground. The A43 was prone to breaking down in testing. The director of the Royal Armoured Corps, Raymond Briggs himself, stepped in and in 1944 stated that he was not prepared to give the Black Prince any go-ahead while it retained this engine. Quoting, "I cannot agree to an order being placed for 300 A43s with Bedford engines at this stage. I have already expressed, I thought adequately, my views on the wisdom of going into production of a tank which will undoubtedly be underpowered. I am not therefore prepared to approve any work order for the A43 with a Bedford engine." The director of the Royal Armoured Corps felt that there will undoubtedly be a requirement for at least 1,300 Churchill tanks in 1945, and on the 28th of April 1944 from Whitehall he wrote that he would wholeheartedly welcome orders for 500 heavy Churchill tanks, these being the Mark VII. Drac also required the A43 to have different weapon setups. If the A43 was to be placed into service after modifications, he required only one have a 17-pounder for evaluation, and that the 77mm gun should be used in common place for the A43, and that a 105mm or 114mm close support howitzer should be used for a CS version, and that the same weapons be fitted to heavy Churchill into a really good hole puncher could be fitted. With this in mind, he noted that the Churchill rework required was becoming a major overhaul scheme, and that Vauxhall should plan for this, and that he felt very strongly that if no good developing an A43 without an engine of less horsepower than the Meteor engine. Tests were carried out in 1944 with the A33, also sometimes known as Excelsior, loaded down to 50 tons, and a Churchill to the same weight. The Director General of the Armoured Fighting Vehicles found that the two were surprisingly comparable in his eyes. He also wrote to the Director of the Royal Armoured Corps saying that to fit the Meteor into the Black Prince would require extensive rework to the suspension and the engine bay itself, and that a design similar to A41 with 6 inches of sloped armour, 4 inches of side armour, and improved suspension would be quicker to produce than converting the A43 over. This would be the foundation for the A45 infantry tank. The Director General of Armoured Fighting Vehicles then told the Director of Royal Armoured Corps that in order for his continuation work to carry on at Vauxhall's, he would be placing an order for 500 heavy Churchills and 300 A43s to enable tooling to be in place. He stipulated one A43 would be built with a 17-pounder, and that if the system was proven, he would commence work with the Meteor-equipped A43s. They later changed this priority, with a 17-pounder taking precedence over the other weapons listed. Vauxhall's replied that they could begin to convert the lines over. However, they insisted that if the new engine was to be used and suspension changed, it would mean the first production A43s would not be ready until mid-1946. Eventually 6 prototypes would be built, but the vehicle's low speed and their new 5-speed gearbox were problematic, as timing had to be precise or the vehicle would jump gears, and due to the low speeds it could obtain, the driver had to start back from the beginning. The A43 by the end of the war was showing little promise. With no support from the Royal Armoured Corps, poor reliability, excessive fuel consumption, and offering nothing that Centurion could not surpass on in every way, the project was cancelled. The 6 prototype vehicles were made in various stages, the original one having a slightly different turret face and the others having small external differences. One survives at Bovington, and despite efforts to get her running, she was prone to stage fright and promptly broke down on her first outing. Another lies with a private collector. There were of course a few merits to the design. It was considered quite spacious and roomy inside, which was popular with the crews, and despite its abysmally slow speed, it still retained the Churchill's ability to climb gradients in low gear. It had a good rate of fire and plentiful ammunition supplies with 90 rounds carried, and was considered a good ride over rough terrain. Had it entered service a year beforehand, it might well have been of some use, but overall it was a dead-end concept by the time it entered service. The Black Prince is one of those tanks that have some that support it and some that deride it. So we'll pass it over to you, the viewer. Where do you stand? Was the Black Prince a monstrous failure or a good tank at the wrong time? Let us know your thoughts and opinions below, and also give us a like and subscribe. And until next time, toodle pip.